Cena saw a man with a little girl, sensed something was off, and in that very moment he realized he was about to uncover a secret that would change everything. The mid-September sun beat down on Dallas, Texas with relentless intensity. Cena lowered the visor of his Camaro as he pulled into the Target parking lot, deliberately choosing a spot far from the entrance to avoid the bustling crowd. After an intense morning workout and several business calls about upcoming projects, he just needed to grab some bottled water and protein bars before heading home. Simple errand in and out. He stepped out of his sleek black vehicle, the heat immediately enveloping him like a heavyweight opponent. As he made his way toward the store entrance, something caught his trained eye. Near a weathered minivan, a small girl, no more than 6 or 7, clutched a stuffed animal to her chest, her body language radiating discomfort. Beside her stood a man in a hooded sweatshirt despite the Texas heat, speaking to her with barely restrained aggression. John slowed his pace, instincts honed from years in the ring and on movie sets, alerting him that something wasn't right. The interaction lacked the natural dynamic between a parent and child. No warmth, no comfortable familiarity. The girl's shoulders were tensed, her eyes downcast, her small frame practically vibrating with fear. He pretended to check his phone, while observing them from his peripheral vision. The man suddenly snatched the stuffed animal from the girl's hands and grabbed her wrist, pulling her roughly toward the van. John's pulse quickened. Years of playing heroes on screen had attuned him to real-life danger, and everything about this scenario felt wrong. John moved closer, maintaining a casual demeanor that belied his racing thoughts. When the girl spotted him, something changed in her expression. A flash of recognition, perhaps, but more importantly, a silent plea. She raised her free hand slightly, a barely perceptible wave that wasn't a greeting but a desperate call for help. "Hey there," John called out, his voice deliberately friendly but firm. "Everything okay here?" The man froze momentarily, his grip tightening visibly on the girl's wrist. "Mind your own business," he spat, not meeting John's eyes directly. "Is she your daughter?" John pressed, closing the distance between them with measured steps. The man hesitated a fraction too long. "My niece," he said, the lie transparent in his shifting gaze. "We're late. Come on." He yanked the girl toward the open door of the van. John saw tears welling in her frightened eyes, and something inside him, the part that had made him defend the underdog throughout his career, snapped into action. He pulled out his phone, holding it up deliberately. "I think we should call the police," he said calmly, "just to clear things up." The threat was enough to trigger panic. The man shoved the girl into the van and leaped into the driver's seat. Tires screeched against asphalt as the vehicle lurched away, but not before John memorized the license plate, a skill he'd developed during his action movie training. Without hesitation, John sprinted back to his Camaro. The powerful engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the parking lot in pursuit. The chase cut through busy intersections and narrow side streets, the minivan driving erratically in an attempt to lose him. John stayed focused, his hands steady on the wheel as adrenaline coursed through his veins. This wasn't a movie scene with choreographed stunts and safety measures. This was real. A child in danger, a predator trying to escape, and only John positioned to intervene. The van swerved suddenly into an alley, miscalculated the turn, and crashed into a light pole. John screeched to a halt and rushed toward the damaged vehicle, heart pounding. The man was dazed but conscious, fumbling for something in his jacket. John recognized the movement. He was reaching for a weapon. Acting on instinct, John wrenched open the driver's door, grabbed the man by his collar, and dragged him onto the pavement, pinning him with professional precision. The girl remained, huddled in the back seat, terrified but unharmed. "You're okay now," John called to her, maintaining his hold on the struggling man. "Help is coming." Within minutes, police sirens filled the air, and John found himself explaining the situation to Detective Mark Sullivan, a veteran officer with weary eyes that had seen too many similar cases. "You did good," Sullivan told him after the man was handcuffed and placed in a patrol car. "This guy's connected to Victor Ramirez's trafficking ring. We've been trying to nail that operation for months. John watched as a female officer wrapped a blanket around the rescued girl's shoulders. What happens to her now? Sullivan's expression darkened. She'll be safe, but Ramirez is still out there, and this is just one small part of his operation. He hesitated, then added, "We have intelligence about a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Could be where they're holding other children before transport, but without concrete evidence, we can't get a warrant." John straightened, determination settling over him like armor. "Then let me get you that evidence." Detective Sullivan's objections faded as John Cena drove away from the police station, GPS coordinates for the suspected warehouse memorized. This wasn't his first encounter with the darker side of humanity. His charity work had exposed him to trafficking survivors before, but knowing children were in immediate danger ignited a fire within him that no movie role had ever captured. The warehouse was located in an industrial zone on the outskirts of Dallas, surrounded by abandoned lots and defunct businesses, the perfect cover for illegal operations. John parked his Camaro behind a derelict gas station a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, using the gathering dusk as cover. 2 armed guards patrolled the perimeter of the chain-link fence surrounding the facility. John observed their pattern from behind a rusted dumpster, noting the timing of their rounds. When the moment was right, he moved with surprising stealth. For a man of his size, scaling the fence at its blind spot and dropping silently to the other side. Inside the warehouse compound, he edged along the shadows of the main building, ducking beneath windows and avoiding the harsh pools of security lights. A side door stood ajar, voices drifting from within. John slipped inside, finding himself in a dimly lit corridor stacked with shipping crates. Following the sounds of conversation, he peered around a corner to see a nightmarish scene. Multiple makeshift cells constructed from chain-link fencing, each containing several children ranging from toddlers to early teens. They sat or lay on thin mattresses, many clutching donated stuffed animals similar to the one the girl at Target had been holding. At a desk across the warehouse floor, a well-dressed man with a trimmed beard was berating 2 subordinates. Even from a distance, John recognized Victor Ramirez from the photos Sullivan had shown him, the kingpin of the trafficking operation, a man who had evaded authorities for years through brutal efficiency and strategic bribes. "The Dallas shipment leaves tomorrow night," Ramirez was saying, his voice carrying across the space. "Our buyers are getting impatient. No more delays." Cold rage filled John's chest. These weren't shipments, they were children, souls with dreams and fears and futures, being commodified by monsters in human skin. He needed evidence, but he also needed to act. Taking out his phone, he began recording video, capturing the faces of Ramirez and his men, the layout of the cells, the trapped children. A small noise behind him made John whirl around. A guard stood frozen in shock, recognizing the celebrity face but unable to process his presence. Before the man could raise his weapon, John struck with precision, knocking him unconscious with a move perfected through years of wrestling training. The commotion alerted Ramirez. "Check the east corridor," he ordered sharply. Footsteps approached. John made a split-second decision. He grabbed a metal pipe leaning against the wall and hurled it across the warehouse, creating a loud distraction in the opposite direction. As Ramirez's men rushed toward the noise, John moved swiftly among the shadows, positioning himself behind a stack of crates near the main office. From this vantage point, he could hear Ramirez on the phone. "We may have a security breach. Yes, everything is still on schedule. The Miami connection is secure." Each word was another piece of evidence, another nail in the criminal's coffin. John continued recording, knowing that Sullivan would need as much information as possible to take down the entire network. A small sound caught his attention, a muffled sob from the nearest cell. A young boy, no older than 8, had spotted John and was staring at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. John placed a finger to his lips, then offered the child a reassuring nod. Help was coming. He needed to get the video to Sullivan immediately. Backing away carefully, John had almost reached the exit when a guard rounded the corner, weapon drawn. "Don't move," the man hissed, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Well, look who it is, the hero himself." John raised his hands slowly, mind racing through possible scenarios. "You don't want to do this," he said calmly. "Law enforcement already knows about this place. They're on their way." The guard's expression wavered with uncertainty. John seized the moment, launching into action with the explosive power that had made him famous. Within seconds, the guard was unconscious, and John was racing through the compound, alarms blaring behind him. He cleared the fence just as vehicles began arriving at the main gate. Not police. Cruisers, but SUVs with tinted windows, reinforcements for Ramirez. John sprinted to his Camaro, tires spinning on gravel as he sped away. 10 minutes later, he stood before Detective Sullivan in the police station, the video evidence transferred to a secure server. Sullivan's team mobilized with remarkable efficiency, coordinating with SWAT units for an immediate raid. "You realize how dangerous that was?" Sullivan said, though the reprimand lacked conviction. "You could have been killed." John watched. As officers prepared tactical gear, his expression resolute. Those kids couldn't wait for warrants and bureaucracy. They needed someone to act now. Sullivan studied him for a long moment. "We go in 20 minutes. You stay here." "Not a chance," John replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm coming with you." The detective opened his mouth to object, then sighed in resignation. "Stay behind the tactical team. This isn't a movie set, Cena. These men won't hesitate to shoot." John nodded grimly. "Neither will I hesitate to stop them." The raid unfolded with military precision. SWAT teams breached the warehouse from multiple entry points, securing the perimeter and neutralizing armed guards before they could organize resistance. John stayed with Sullivan, moving in after the initial breach to help with the children, many of whom were too terrified to respond to the officers. Victor Ramirez was cornered in his office, attempting to delete files from a computer when John and Sullivan entered. The criminal's eyes widened in recognition before narrowing with hatred. "John Cena," he spat. "Playing hero off-screen now. You should have stayed in Hollywood. You have no idea what you've stumbled into." Sullivan stepped forward with handcuffs. "Victor Ramirez, you're under arrest for human trafficking, kidnapping, racketeering." Ramirez lunged suddenly, revealing a concealed weapon. John reacted, with instinctive speed, tackling the man before he could fire. They crashed into the desk, grappling for control. Despite his size advantage, John found himself facing an opponent driven by desperation and rage. A sharp pain exploded in his side. Ramirez had pulled a hidden knife. John ignored the wound, focusing on immobilizing the trafficker's arms. With a final surge of strength, he pinned Ramirez to the floor, allowing Sullivan to secure the handcuffs. "It's over," John said, breathing heavily as he stood. Blood seeped through his shirt, but his attention was already elsewhere, on the children being led from their cells by gentle-handed officers and social workers. The boy who had spotted John earlier broke away from his group and ran to him, wrapping thin arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "I knew you were real," the child whispered. "I told the others you would come." John knelt to eye level, momentarily overwhelmed by the trust in the boy's gaze. "You're safe now," he promised. "All of you are." As paramedics treated his knife wound, John watched Sullivan coordinating the operation, ensuring each child was accounted for and properly cared for. The evidence recovered from Ramirez's computers would lead to further arrests across multiple states, dismantling a network that had operated with impunity for years. "We couldn't have done this without you," Sullivan admitted, joining John as the scene was processed. "Though I'd still prefer civilians not launch their own vigilante investigations." John managed a tired smile. "Consider it a one-time guest appearance." Later that night, as he gave his official statement at police headquarters, a social worker approached with a familiar face, the girl from the Target parking lot, the one whose silent plea had started everything. She clutched a new stuffed animal, this one a plush tiger with oversized paws. "She asked to see you before going to her emergency placement," the social worker explained. "She hasn't spoken much, but she wanted to thank you." The girl stepped forward shyly, then surprised everyone by extending the tiger toward John. "For you," she said, her voice barely audible. "To protect you too." John accepted the gift with the solemnity it deserved, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said. "I'll keep it with me." As the social worker led the child away, John turned to find Sullivan watching him with newfound respect. "You know," the detective said thoughtfully, "we could use someone like you as a consultant for our Crimes Against Children unit, someone who notices what others miss." John glanced down at the stuffed tiger in his hands, thinking about the roles he'd played throughout his career: the action hero, the comedian, the tough guy with a heart of gold. None compared to the real-world impact of the past 24 hours. "I'll consider it," he said, and meant it. The Dallas County Courthouse hummed with tension on the morning of Victor Ramirez's arraignment. 3 months had passed since the warehouse raid. Months filled with further investigations, arrests of Ramirez's associates, and painstaking work to reunite trafficked children with their families or place them in safe environments. John Cena sat in the gallery, the scar on his side a fading reminder of his confrontation with Ramirez. Beside him sat Detective Sullivan, who had become something of a friend during the ongoing case. They watched as Ramirez entered in handcuffs, his expensive suit and confident demeanor a stark contrast to the shackles around his ankles. "How's the consulting going?" Sullivan asked quietly as they waited for proceedings to begin. John had taken the detective's suggestion, working part-time with the Crimes Against Children unit, using his celebrity status to raise awareness and funding while also contributing his surprisingly effective observational skills to active cases. "Different from what I'm used to," John admitted. "But important," Sullivan nodded. "The DA says this is airtight. Multiple charges across 3 states. Ramirez is looking at consecutive life sentences." Something in the detective's tone made John glance at him. "But?" Sullivan sighed. "His network was extensive. We've identified at least 2 major players who are still operating, likely with knowledge of his methods and contacts. The fight's far from over." Before John could respond, the bailiff called for all to rise as the judge entered. The legal proceedings moved forward with procedural efficiency. Charges read, lawyers making statements. Ramirez pleaded not guilty, his eyes occasionally drifting to John with undisguised malice. During a brief recess, John stepped into the hallway for air, finding himself face to face with a woman whose features he recognized from photos. Maria Ramirez, Victor's wife, who had claimed ignorance of her husband's criminal enterprises. "Mr. Cena," she said, her voice low but clear. "May I speak with you privately?" John hesitated, then nodded, following her to a quiet alcove near the water fountains. Maria glanced around nervously before producing a flash drive from her purse. "Victor kept records," she said, pressing the device into his hand. "Names, dates, locations, not just his operation but others connected to it. Powerful people, Mr. Cena, people who won't hesitate to eliminate threats." Her voice trembled slightly. "I found this in our home safe. I've made my peace with Victor facing justice, but these others, they've threatened my children." John studied her face, looking for deception, but finding only fear. "Why give this to me? Why not the police?" "Because I don't know who is compromised," she whispered. "But I know who you are, not just the celebrity, but the man who risked his life for children he didn't know. My husband called you a fool for it. I call you the only person I can trust with this." She walked away quickly, leaving John holding what could be the key to dismantling multiple trafficking networks, or a trap designed to discredit the case against Ramirez. He found Sullivan immediately, explaining the encounter. The detective examined the flash drive with professional caution. "We'll need to have cybersecurity check this before accessing it. Could be infected, could be nothing." He pocketed the device. "Let's focus on today's hearing. We can deal with Maria's gift afterward." As they returned to the courtroom, John noticed unusual movement near the entrance, court officers speaking in hushed tones, hands moving toward weapons. His instincts, honed through years of performing in unpredictable environments, spiked in warning. The first gunshot shattered the formal atmosphere into chaos. 3 armed men had entered the courtroom, firing at the ceiling and shouting for everyone to get down. Panic erupted as people dove for cover beneath benches and tables. John pulled Sullivan down behind a wooden partition, assessing the situation with remarkable clarity. This was no random attack. It was a coordinated attempt to either free Ramirez or silence him permanently. "They're blocking the main exits," John observed, watching the gunmen's movements. One approached Ramirez, keys in hand, while the others maintained covering positions. Sullivan drew his weapon. "Backup will be here in minutes, but that might be too late." John made a decision, driven by the same instinct that had led him to intervene at the target parking lot. "Create a distraction at my signal. I'll take the one nearest Ramirez." Before Sullivan could protest, John had moved along the row of benches, using the chaos and screaming as cover. He positioned himself behind a toppled table, waiting until the gunman reached Ramirez's side and began unlocking his restraints. "Now!" John shouted. Sullivan fired 2 shots toward the ceiling, drawing the attention of the other gunmen. In that moment of distraction, John launched himself across the space, tackling the man beside Ramirez with devastating force. They crashed into the defendant's table, the gunman's weapon skittering across the floor. Courthouse security had responded to the initial shots, engaging the remaining attackers in a firefight that sent fragments of wood and plaster raining down. Civilians scrambled toward emergency exits as officers shouted instructions. John grappled with his opponent, a professionally trained fighter whose technique suggested military or special forces background. They exchanged blows that would have incapacitated lesser men, each seeking the advantage in close-quarter combat. A sharp crack resounded as John finally managed to slam the attacker's head against the wooden railing, rendering him unconscious. He turned to secure Ramirez, only to find the trafficker already fleeing toward a side door, his shackles discarded. "Sullivan," John called, pointing toward the escaping defendant. The detective nodded in understanding, pursuing Ramirez while John helped subdue the remaining attackers alongside court officers. Minutes later, the gunfire ceased. 2 attackers were dead, one unconscious from John's intervention, and the courthouse secured. But Victor Ramirez and Detective Sullivan were nowhere to be seen. John followed the path they had taken, pushing through the emergency exit into a service corridor. Blood droplets on the floor formed a macabre trail. Someone was injured. He moved cautiously, alert for danger, until he heard labored breathing around a corner. He found Sullivan seated against the wall, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder, his service weapon still gripped in his other hand. "Ramirez?" John asked, kneeling to examine the detective's wound. Sullivan grimaced. "Got away, had a car waiting in the loading dock. Professional extraction." He winced as John applied pressure to the gunshot wound. "This was planned, John. Someone knew exactly when and where to hit us." Paramedics arrived quickly, taking over Sullivan's care. As they prepared to transport him to the hospital, the detective grabbed John's arm with surprising strength. "The flash drive," he said urgently. "It's in my jacket pocket. Don't trust anyone with it until we know who's compromised." John retrieved the device discreetly, nodding his understanding. "I'll find him, Mark. We'll finish this." In the aftermath of the courthouse attack, law enforcement agencies descended on Dallas in full force: FBI, Marshals Service, State Police. John provided his statement multiple times, describing the attackers and the sequence of events. But he kept the flash drive to himself, remembering Sullivan's warning. That night, in the security of his hotel room, John inserted the drive into a clean laptop purchased specifically for this purpose. What he found confirmed Maria Ramirez's claims: detailed records of trafficking operations across North America, Europe, and Asia, with names of facilitators, corrupt officials, and clients, some recognized from politics, entertainment, and business. Most critically, the files revealed the identity of the 2 major players Sullivan had mentioned: Alexander Brennan, a shipping magnate whose containers provided transportation, and Senator James Wilson, whose charitable foundation served as both money laundering operation and access point to vulnerable children in developing countries. John encrypted the data and made multiple backups before contacting the one person he believed he could trust: FBI Special Agent Rebecca Chen, whose reputation for incorruptibility was matched only by her success rate in trafficking prosecutions. "This goes higher than we imagined," Chen said after reviewing the evidence in a secure facility. Wilson chairs the committee that oversees our budget. Brennan donates millions to police foundations across the country. John leaned forward, his expression resolute. Then we build a case they can't bury, starting with finding Ramirez. Intelligence suggested that Ramirez had been moved to a private compound owned by Brennan in rural East Texas, likely preparing for transport out of the country. With time running short and official channels potentially compromised, John and Agent Chen assembled a small team of absolutely trusted personnel for a high-risk operation. Sullivan, arm in a sling but determined to see the case through, joined them for planning. "This is beyond unofficial," he warned. "If anything goes wrong, none of us has authorization to be there." "Then nothing goes wrong," John replied simply. The compound was heavily guarded, surrounded by dense forest that provided both cover for approach and challenges for escape. Using thermal imaging drones, they identified multiple armed patrols and pinpointed Ramirez's likely location in the main house. Under cover of darkness, John led the infiltration team through the perimeter defenses, using non-lethal takedowns to clear a path to the main building. Years of performing his own stunts had prepared him for the physical demands, while months working with law enforcement had honed his tactical awareness. They breached the house silently, neutralizing interior guards before they could raise alarms. In the basement office, they found Victor Ramirez meeting with Alexander Brennan, both men startled by the sudden appearance of armed intruders. "It's over," John announced as Chen and her agents secured the room. "Victor Ramirez, Alexander Brennan, you're under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder of a police officer." Brennan recovered quickly from his surprise, his aristocratic features settling into disdain. "You have no jurisdiction here, no warrant, and no future in law enforcement after this stunt." His gaze fixed on John. "And you, Mr. Cena. Such a disappointment to your fans, playing vigilante instead of staying in your lane." John stepped closer, towering over the shipping magnate. "My lane is wherever children are in danger from predators like you." As they were securing the prisoners, an agent burst in with urgent news. Their operation had been detected, and reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions. What had been a carefully planned extraction suddenly became a desperate fight for survival. "We need to move now," Sullivan urged, his injured arm limiting his combat effectiveness, but not his strategic thinking. "The helipad on the east side is our best extraction point." They moved as a unit through the compound, Ramirez and Brennan in restraints between them, exchanging fire with security forces converging on their position. John found himself protecting Sullivan, whose determination exceeded his physical capability in his injured state. At the helipad, they found their escape helicopter already destroyed, sabotaged by someone who had anticipated their plan. Surrounded, outgunned, with no extraction and their communications jammed, the situation seemed hopeless. John surveyed their deteriorating tactical position, a strange calm settling over him. Throughout his career, he had faced impossible odds in scripted scenarios. Now, facing genuine danger, he found the same clarity that had served him in the ring and on set. "I'll create a diversion," he told Chen and Sullivan. "Get the prisoners to the North Service Road. There's a maintenance shed with vehicles." Sullivan shook his head. "That's suicide, John." "No," John replied with the confidence that had made him a star. "That's what I do, make people look where I want them to look." He handed Sullivan a backup of the flash drive data. "Make sure this gets to the right people if I don't make it." Before anyone could stop him, John moved to the compound's generator station, creating a timer from available materials, a skill learned from an action film 2 years prior. He set explosives taken from a neutralized guard to detonate in sequence across the property. The first explosion drew security forces to the south perimeter, allowing Chen's team to move their prisoners toward the service road. The second blast disabled the compound's power, plunging everything into darkness except for emergency lighting. John fought his way through the confusion, disabling opponents using the environment and darkness to his advantage. He was nearing the rendezvous point when a figure emerged from the shadows. A familiar face from Ramirez's operation, the lieutenant who had escaped the warehouse raid. "I should have stayed a celebrity," the man growled, revealing a military-grade combat knife. "Now you die a nobody." What followed was a brutal, desperate fight in near darkness. John took multiple cuts, including a deep slash across his chest, but his opponent underestimated the authentic combat training he had accumulated over years of professional wrestling and film work. With a final, decisive movement, John incapacitated his attacker and staggered toward the service road, blood soaking his shirt. He found the team already securing Ramirez and Brennan in a maintenance truck. "Cutting it close," Sullivan remarked, relief evident beneath his casual tone. John managed a pained smile, wanted to build suspense. As they drove away from the compound, sirens wailed in the distance, legitimate law enforcement responding to reports of explosions, unaware of the unofficial operation that had just succeeded against impossible odds. 6 months later, John Cena stood before a significantly different audience than the cheering fans he was accustomed to. The congressional hearing room was packed with journalists, law enforcement officials, and families of trafficking victims. Senator James Wilson was noticeably absent from his usual committee chair, his seat empty, following his arrest and indictment. "Mr. Cena," the acting committee chair began, "you've provided written testimony regarding the events in Dallas and your subsequent involvement in the apprehension of Victor Ramirez and Alexander Brennan. Would you summarize for the committee the broader implications of this case?" John leaned toward the microphone, the scar on his chest hidden beneath his suit, but the one on his face visible to all, a permanent reminder of his battle at Brennan's compound. What began as a chance encounter had a target parking lot revealed an international criminal enterprise protected by wealth, power, and institutional corruption, he stated, his voice carrying the same conviction that had once entertained millions. But it also revealed something more important, that individual action matters, that seeing something wrong and choosing to intervene can save lives. He continued, outlining how the evidence from Maria Ramirez's flash drive had led to over 300 arrests across 12 countries, the rescue of nearly 500 trafficked individuals, and the seizure of assets worth billions. The investigation had uncovered corruption in law enforcement, border patrol, and politics, leading to a comprehensive reform initiative. The system failed these children, John concluded, but individual people within that system refused to accept that failure. Detective Mark Sullivan, Agent Rebecca Chen, and dozens of others risked everything to pursue justice when institutional barriers stood in their way. After the hearing, John met with Sullivan and Chen in a quiet corner of the Capitol building. Sullivan, now heading a national task force on trafficking prevention, had fully recovered from his injuries. Chen had been promoted to lead the FBI's expanded Crimes Against Children division. "The Ramirez-Brennan trial starts next month," Sullivan informed him. "With the evidence we secured and cooperating witnesses, conviction is virtually guaranteed." "And Wilson?" John asked. "Singing like a canary to reduce his sentence," Chen replied with grim satisfaction. "His testimony is implicating officials in 3 countries." John nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. His unexpected detour into the real world of crime fighting had changed him profoundly, altering his perspective on his career and public platform. "I've been offered a role," he told them, playing a detective who uncovers a trafficking ring. Based loosely on all this, he gestured vaguely to encompass their shared experience. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Going back to Hollywood?" "Yes and no," John answered thoughtfully. "I'm taking the role, but I've also established a foundation focused on trafficking prevention and survivor support. The film's proceeds will fund it." Chen smiled. "Using your platform where it can do the most good. Smart." As they prepared to part ways, a staff member approached with a message. A young visitor was asking to see John. They found her waiting. In a small anteroom, the girl from the Target parking lot, now demonstrating the resilience of children by smiling shyly as John entered. Beside her stood her adoptive mother, a social worker who had been part of the original rescue operation. "She wanted to thank you properly," the woman explained. "She's doing very well now." The girl stepped forward, clearly nervous but determined. "I kept your picture," she said, her voice stronger than it had been 6 months ago. "From the magazine. I told my class you saved me. They didn't believe me at first." John knelt to her level, his expression gentle. What's important is that you believed in yourself enough to ask for help. That was very brave. She beamed at his words, then grew serious. Are you going to save more kids? The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. John thought about the foundation he was building, the awareness campaign launching next month, the policy reforms his testimony had supported. I'm going to try, he promised. Not alone, with help from many people, but yes, that's the plan. Later, as he left the Capitol building, John paused on the steps, watching tourists take photos and school groups tour the grounds. Normal life. Continuing while in the shadows, battles against trafficking networks still raged. His phone buzzed with messages from his agent, questions about upcoming projects, appearance requests, endorsement offers. The familiar rhythm of celebrity life called him back to the world he knew. But John Cena had changed. He had glimpsed a different kind of heroism than the scripted variety, one with real stakes, real consequences, and real impact. He had discovered that the line between playing a hero and being one was thinner than he'd imagined, crossed not through superhuman feats, but through simple human choices: to notice, to care, to act. As he descended the steps toward his waiting car, a reporter called out to him, "Mr. Cena, what's next for you?" John smiled, the scar on his face catching the afternoon light. "Whatever needs doing," he replied, and meant it.